"You're pathetic, Daniel. Everyone can see it," Emily said, sharp as a broken bottle, and the restaurant went quiet like a TV turned off mid-sentence. Forks paused, the waiter shifted his weight, my sister-in-law's laugh cracked and stopped. And across from me, my father-in-law Thomas. Bennett's face settled into the kind of calm that meant the room had already decided. "My name is Daniel Ross. I'm 42 from Cincinnati, Ohio, and for a second that one plain line feels like a punch stuck between my ribs. The numbers of my life, age and place, and 100 small compromises laid out like unpaid bills." I had walked into the holiday brunch with a paper coffee cup sweating in my hand, and a smile I kept folding back into my mouth because the thing I was carrying, the ticket crumpled like a quiet bird, had weight and heat and a future clutched against my chest, and she had ripped it open like a child who thinks the loud noise is the point of the present. "How did you even get this far?" she went on, and the syllables were honeyed for the table and barbed for me, working those dead-end shifts, buying the cheap shoes, always trying to impress people who already think you're a joke. There were people I had come to impress that day. My son Noah sitting with coloring pages, eyes wide and hungry for the version of me that could be proud, and my sister-in-law Rachel glancing at her phone as if the humiliation were content for later. I had been saving for months to take them out, to act like everything had finally lined up, but the ticket was the thing I wanted to give them before I gave them anything else. Proof that the manure of 10 years could sprout something else. The hush after Emily's words felt like being dipped in cold water and left to steady. My mouth made a small laugh that didn't reach my throat because the laugh would seem like pleading, and pleading around that table would mean I had already lost. She stood very deliberately, gathering the crumbs and napkins with her hands like a woman folding up a life she meant to discard. Gloria Bennett, her mother, slipped a hand into Emily's and said, soft and precise, "We always told you, Daniel, aim higher." The word higher came like a verdict in a room of witnesses. Bystanders shifted. A couple at the next table edged their stroller away. A guy at the bar tapped his glass as if rhythm could cancel the songs of humiliation taking place. I thought, in a small, embarrassed pocket of my head, about the cheap truck I still drove, about the promotions I had almost got, and the ones someone else had taken, about the mortgage calls I returned at midnight. I watched Emily's mouth make the shape of a laugh that wanted the room to be free of sympathy. It wasn't enough for her to leave. She wanted to cause an audience. She bundled a couple of bags with a practiced efficiency and said, like someone reciting an excuse, "There's someone better for us now." The line meant to be a hammer blow, and Marcus Halle walked in then, all cologne and clean cufflinks, and sat like a man who had been invited because his presence would redeem the spectacle. I could see my son reach for me across the table. I could feel the warmth of that ticket in my pocket like a second heartbeat, and I did not stand up. I did not beg. I sat and let them take the room because every lit match they set to my dignity would light something else in me. The anger that rose was not a sudden thing, but a precise instrument finding purchase. "You'll be sorry," I wanted to say, and that would have been the kind of threat that dissolves under the fluorescent lights of diners and family rooms. So I said nothing louder than a quiet, measured, "Okay," and watched them go, watched my son tucked under his grandmother's arm, while Emily turned to give me one last look that was not pity but a charge of contempt. They left the keys on the counter like an eviction notice. The kitchen grease still smelled like Sunday. The fridge hummed with someone else's future, and on the cabinet I left a note with nothing in it because I knew the truth would be more effective than any emotional outburst. I didn't tell them about the ticket. There was a period after the sentence in my head that did not need punctuation. I walked out into my old truck, drove to a parking lot where a man in a cheap suit could hand me anonymity for a few minutes, and folded the paper the way you fold something you want to hide. Pressed, careful, and visible. I did not weep. I did not try to stop them in the doorway. I drove like a man who had learned to count his losses and found a less obvious currency: patience. The first quotable thought that rose then felt like a plank across a canyon. A man keeps his worth like you keep your teeth. You only notice what's missing in the dark. It lasted longer in my head than I expected, and that sentence, ridiculous and true, was the only line I let become a rule. People talk about revenge like it's a sudden ignition, but the humblest fire is built log by log, and mine was going to be unremarkable and precise and legal and irreversible. I cashed the ticket privately, in a windowless office, where the man behind the counter asked me to sign my name, and I felt no superstition about it. "Money is a set of promises," he said, and he stamped the papers like an oath. I took every precaution. I hired a lawyer named Claire Morrison who treated secrets like contracts and took her coffee black and cold. She found a way to secure anonymity, to distribute the funds into structures that looked like corporate names and land trusts, and she smiled at me with the kind of approval a woman reserves for people who do not make dumb mistakes. The first days after the brunch, I slept with the phone face down and woke with a quiet understanding of the calculation I had made. To keep my son safe from the circus, to keep Noah's picture on my desk and away from the public auction of feelings. I bought a small house in a neighborhood that smelled of cut grass and early morning grills. I put a swing in the yard and a soundproof nursery for my son when loose weekend visits came, because visits would still come, because love and duty are complicated, and sometimes you choose to pay for them in cash. I became what their contempt had predicted I would not. I learned how to make money obey me like a trained animal. I did not revel in the opulence. I treated it like an instrument, a way to move the world instead of letting the world move me. I learned to drink bourbon that lasted like a thought, to read contracts in the way other men read sports pages. When Emily and Gloria and Thomas texted months later, apologizing on autopilot like storm drains unsettled by bad weather, I replied with stock phrases that were wet bandages over a wound I was not ready to show them. I said, "I hope you are well," and the words were a measuring stick for their audacity. They had left for Marcus Halle, who had promised them a life of electric cars and designer boots. They had chosen a man whose bank account was built on borrowed confidence and fast edges. I watched from a respectable distance while their new world unspooled like cheap string. The first time I saw Emily again in public, she smiled with the practiced smile of someone who owes an audience. She didn't know I had bought the small strip mall where Marcus had opened a consultancy, and she didn't know that my funds had quietly taken positions in several of the companies he had used to launder his image. He had been loud and visible. I had been quiet and effective. The engineer in me found a kind of pleasure in the slow application of pressure, in the way a well-placed pivot can close a door that a sledgehammer never will. I built something behind the scenes that would let justice feel like inevitability rather than spectacle, and I entered each day with a ledger of small legal moves that the law bows to because money is persuasive, and paperwork is the language of consequence. I was careful to never cross a line. The satire of revenge is that it's often performed by men who think loudness is power, and I refused that theater. I wanted no shouting from rooftops. I wanted instead a series of doors closing quietly on them. Accounts frozen, contracts defaulted, partnerships dissolving when the bills came due and no one saw the connection. Love gave me a weakness I carried like a stone in my pocket. Betrayal gave me the skill of a mason. I built walls. The second section of my life rose on the foundation of patience, and the cost for them would be the slow erosion of everything they had once counted on. You can't build a future out of someone else's respect, I thought once while watching my son swing under a sky that smelled like cut lawn and rain, and the sentence sat in me like a compass pointing north toward the work I'd chosen. I met Marcus out of coincidence twice. At a charity gala where he tried to act like he had always been invited, and once at a local gym where he flexed his noise like an instrument. Each time, he looked like a man who had been taught to buy validation and never given the humility to keep it. He waved like a man used to being included without question. I smiled like a man who could keep his head. Meanwhile, their credit unraveled in small practical ways. The line of high-end credit Marcus had boasted about collapsed under scrutiny. Invoices for ornate renovations appeared unpaid. The contractors raised their voices and filed liens. Emily called me once, voice thin with winter and shame. Daniel, Marcus is sick. We made a mistake, and it was a sermon of the helpless, the perfunctory plea of someone who had always believed the world owed her an answer. I listened with the patience of a judge and said, "You'll need a place to land," which had the practical sound of a man ready to help and the moral distance of someone who would not trip into pity. Every legal filing that unfolded against Marcus's name, I had initiated not with malice, but with an economy of evidence. I sent anonymous tips to reporters, I forwarded documents to creditors, and I made sure that the truth of his business practices could be verified on paper. The law liked to be fed receipts, and I fed it. No conspiracy, only paperwork and timing and a willingness to see a contract through the end of its clauses. Marcus's empire, a facade of lacquered furniture and borrowed prestige, started to look like a house of cards and photographs. Glossy images from his Instagram faded next to lawsuits and payment demands. Thomas and Gloria began to whisper about the cost of their choices. Emily's calls dwindled to scattered messages at night that always started, "I know I hurt you," the format of a confession that wanted absolution. I did not open the door. I did not let them sleep in the bed of my pity. I had the ticket. I had a life to rebuild. I had a son who deserved a father who did not apologize for survival. The private pleasures of watching their world thin were not ones I owned without guilt. They were complicated like any human triumph built on the ruins of someone else's bad choices. I kept my satisfactions measured. A house with better insulation, a school with teachers who noticed Noah's handwriting, an accountant who could make the complex simple. I learned to sleep again without the sticky residue of resentment at the back of my teeth. I cultivated friends who did not owe me anything, who laughed at my jokes and didn't measure me by the car I drove. I took my son on a road trip to the lake and taught him to fish and told him stories of my father in a voice that was not bitter, but true. At night I sat on a porch and let the dark teach me how to be patient with the way consequences work. The trap I set was not a single dramatic snare, but a network of small truths. Marcus had been careless with signatures. He had co-signed for leases and left them poorly documented. When his primary account was frozen after a creditor's notion, one sent with the cold efficiency of a man who understands where to press. His payroll halting like a heart attack, the ripple reached the people who had ridden his coattails, Emily and her parents. They discovered overnight that the life Marcus had promised had been a string of IOUs and pre-sold futures. The designer shoes were repossessed, the down payments defaulted. I watched the dominoes fall from a distance because justice that feels like mercy is more effective than the quick slap of vengeance. I began to place calls that seemed casual and then weren't. To an old contractor who had invoices unpaid, to an editor at a local paper who liked corruption so long as it had human names attached, to a bank manager who appreciated a clean file. Each phone call placed a weight on a scale that had always been unbalanced in their favor, and the weight tipped. My hands were clean enough to sleep at night. Everything I did had a paper trail. When Emily's car was towed outside a shopping mall and her phone went unanswered for hours, the panic gave her a clarity the others lacked. I had a private account where I did not bank my cruelty but stored my plans. I became the sort of man who invests in the eventual collapse of false facades. I think the hardest thing was learning to watch someone you once loved dismantle themselves without reaching a hand to pull them back. Love doesn't obligate you to behave like a doormat. I had a relationship with power now that was quiet and adult. I used money to buy peace, not spectacle. There was a moment, months after the brunch, when Marcus's consultancy was shuttered by creditors and he left town with a suitcase and a story about betrayal. He called once and said, slurred and resigned, "You got me, Daniel," which was both confession and a threat that fell flat. I smiled then, not because I enjoyed his downfall, but because the arithmetic of living honestly had finally paid off. I started to put small rules into practice around Noah about what dignity looked like when stripped of safety nets. We don't beg for kindness, we demand to be treated with decency. I entered into business ventures that were dull and steady, a logistics company, a small chain of laundromats, because utility is harder to corrupt than glamour. These moves were not glamorous, but they were stable. Stability is the real revenge against the people who decorate their lives with flash. The tightening of the noose came in paperwork that arrived at Emily's parents' house in the middle of the night. Tax liens, contractor letters, and a notice that the small company they had relied on for landscaping had filed claims for unpaid fees. They had not anticipated accounting would be their undoing. I had not dreamed of a single moment of theatrical reveal. Instead, the noose tightened as the bills came due and the easy credit evaporated. I had coaches and lawyers and accountants who all spoke the formal language of consequence: names, dates, signatures. I attended the unraveling like a physician at the bedside of someone who refused to stop smoking. My heart hurt, but it was not my first duty to fix someone who had thrown themselves away. The trap had become an instrument of proof more than punishment. Contracts revealed illegalities in Marcus's consulting work. Creditors filed claims. Foreclosure notices found their way to a mailbox once filled with pride. Then Emily came back, quiet and small, asking for a roof and some semblance of assistance, her pride thinner than a paper cup. She expected crumbs, an apology, the sort of thing people expect from men they have ransacked: indulgence. She did not expect me to have a ledger of everything the family had owed in goodwill and the equivalent in dollars. She did not expect me to have a lawyer with the patience of a hawk and the willingness to carry the paperwork through court. I called her to a coffee shop because I knew she would want to do it in a place where pity could be purchased cheaply. She came with a small bag and a voice that wanted to make amends without consequences. I had the winning ticket the night she walked out, and I had kept it like a silent prayer. That fact was mine to reveal or not, and there is a kind of power in the decision to show mercy and in the decision to show no mercy at all. The trap I had set was ready. A public unmasking that would not look like cruelty but would, in legal terms, be reckoning. I arranged a meeting at an estate auction where relatives and neighbors would be present, people who had witnessed the old life and would now watch the legal truth. The auction house smelled like old varnish and privilege. Velvet ropes were pulled back like a stage, and I walked in with my lawyer because there are times when you present a case not in a courthouse, but in front of an audience that remembers. Emily arrived late, hair pulled back, cheeks hollowed by months of worry, and she saw the bank accounts, the trustees, the paperwork filed in her name that showed years of unpaid returns and lending agreements Marcus had signed and abandoned. She saw the faces of men who had loaned money in good faith and now wanted restitution, faces that did not care about marriage vows. I sat calm as a man who had practiced restraint, and when she asked, voice fraying, "Daniel, what did you do with the ticket?" I let the room hold the question like a suspended weight. The revelation was surgical. I told them, quietly, that I had cashed it the night she left, that I had placed the funds into trusts for Noah and for the settlements that would cover the debts Marcus had left behind, that I had ensured the money was used to pay what needed to be paid and to secure what had been broken. People took a long breath. There was a small staccato of footsteps as the crowd rearranged their assumptions. The look on Emily's face was not one of surprise. She had known, in some corner of her calculating mind, that I had done something, but of devastation that the man she had dismissed had been the hand holding the only lifeline they'd now need. The laws are a kind of language, and I had learned to speak them fluently. The trustees I had set up had clauses that would restrict misuse and allow me to enforce them. Marcus was being pursued by creditors who now had a name and a paper trail. When he attempted to file chapter something or other in another state, the filings from the year he'd left were waiting like boomerangs. The classic theatrical ending would be a public scene where I stand and deliver a speech, but I am not that man. I let the work of institutions do my voicing for me. The creditors foreclosed, contractors reclaimed their labor. Marcus's reputation collapsed into a string of unpaid invoices and angry emails and, eventually, a quiet move out of state with no forwarding number. Emily tried once, in the heat of it, to claim that she had been kept in the dark and that I had robbed her. She tried to leverage motherhood into entitlement. There are legal forms for these things, and her claims were thin when placed against firm paperwork and the testimony of witnesses who had watched Marcus's lies like a slow leak. I did not make the final move. The law did. The poetic justice was that when the dust settled and the last lien was placed and the estate agents packed the furniture, it was clear who had planned for catastrophe and who had been carried along by a man who was a stranger to responsibility. Emily's attempts to take more than what the law allowed were met with a quiet and absolute refusal. Her public pleas for sympathy were answered by creditors with statements about unpaid debts, and by neighbors who remembered the brunch and the words thrown like stones. The humiliation she had handed me returned in a meticulously legal mirror. She was painted as someone whose choices had consequences. Marcus, whose name had been a bright borrowed flame, left like a man who was a story with the last page torn out. Thomas and Gloria faced their own shares of shame as community members who had publicly judged a son-in-law and then found themselves embroiled in liens and lawsuits. The community's opinion is not an army, but it is a market, and markets punish rash investments in character. I watched them shrink under the weight of bills and the absence of credit. They learned what it costs to live on someone else's money and how quickly that someone else can stop paying when the truth comes on paper. My son came to me in the quiet aftermath with the clean, untarnished loyalty of a child and asked, "Did you do it for us, Dad?" And the honest answer was complicated and enormous and small. Yes and no. I did it because there is a difference between mercy and enabling, because a boy needs a father who can stand without apology, because some lessons require legal clarity rather than theatrical redemption. The final moments coalesced into a daytime courtroom hearing where Emily tried to insist that she had a right to a share of funds on the basis of marriage and proximity. The judge read through filings that showed clearly the night she had left, and the signed paperwork that showed the ticket had been cashed before handover. The law does not decide on moral nuances the way families do. It decides on evidence and signatures and dates. The judge awarded Emily a small settlement that reflected some practical obligations, but not the windfall she had imagined. She could have argued with better papers, but she had chosen speed and appearance over careful stewardship. She left the courthouse with a bag and a face that held years of expectation now empty. Marcus, for his part, was served with an injunction that froze his assets and called for restitution. The man who had promised rescue was the one rescued in the end by court documents that revoked his ability to profit from false promises. In the end, the betrayer was not physically harmed. She was destroyed in the only way that mattered to the people she had courted for status, publicly, financially, and reputationally. I did not dance on the ashes. The victory had the flavor of cold iron. I walked away scarred in ways that could not be stitched. Trust is not a fabric that stitches back the same way. But I also walked away with a certainty that felt like armor. Justice, when pursued patiently and legally, does not require spectacle to be complete. I put my son to bed that night and told him plainly 2 sentences that would stand as a life lesson. Do your work, keep your word, and don't let someone else's applause measure your worth. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. It helps us share more true stories like this.